Welcome to Sex and Mental Health, a mini-series from victims and villains that is examining the good, the bad, and the sometimes ugly interactions between sex and mental health. In our second episode of the series, we are diving into the world of kink. In this episode, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Kate Sloan. Kate is an accomplished sex journalist and the author behind 101 Kinky Things Even You Can Do, among many other titles. In this episode, we discuss what the definition of kink is, misconceptions on what it is, and the multifaceted misconceptions that also exist within the community, the positive mental health effects of kink, the importance of a safe word, and much more. She can be found at katesloan.com, or you can click the links in our show notes below. We hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Sex and Mental Health, and if you guys haven't checked out our inaugural episode discussing communication and mental health when it comes to the world of sex, please click the links in our show notes below, or wait until after this video and watch it right here on YouTube.
Sloan, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
I blew through this book. I know that you're the author of many other books, and but yeah, I blew through this book, and I love the way that it's kind of structured to where it kind of gives this very standardized definition of all 101 things, and then it kind of gives like practical steps on like how to try it like solo, then kind of move into like conversations. What just kind of like jumping off of, where does something like this come from, and what is the research process to kind of basically create this list, this really in-depth list as well?
Yeah, sure. I received an email a few years back from a commissioning editor at a publishing house in the UK, Lawrence King, and they reached out and basically said, like, we think we want to do a book that's about sex in some way, and you seem like a go-to person on that, but we don't really know like what we want it to be about at all. So they asked me to pitch them some stuff, and I have like occasionally thought about what I would write a book about, because like being a writer, you know, it's something you think about. But the things that I pitched them, I think, were way too like dense and complicated and niche and nerdy for what they were looking for. And then we landed on the idea of 101 unusual kinks and fetishes, because I have always been interested in like really niche fetishes, like sneezing fetish or clown fetish, or just interesting stuff like this. Like, I've always found it interesting to research it. But after we sort of talked through that, we realized it probably makes more sense from a marketing perspective and a demographic perspective to like try to write something that anybody could read. And so then it turned into this idea of kinky things even you can do. And it's meant to be like a really, not quite exhaustive, because you can never really write something that includes every kink in the world, because the human imagination is just boundless. But I think it's 101 things that a lot of people could figure out how to do and could figure out how to find hot, even if they've never tried kink before. And I had never really thought about writing a Kink 101 book before, but I'm really happy with how it came out.
So I want to just kind of start at the beginning, because we, in this series so far, we haven't really defined the definitions between what a kink is. And I think the term kink or kinky, it ultimately kind of has this negative connotation around it, and can be scary, unfamiliar, and kind of having this as kind of a great segue into the purpose of the book is, how would you define what a kink is and kind of make it, I guess, a little bit less deconstructed, to be less scary for those that may be outside of that community?
Yeah, that was definitely one of the more difficult things about writing this book, was trying to define kink, because it is such a broad-ranging term. It's basically an umbrella term for like an almost infinite number of different activities. And usually the way it's defined is like a sexual desire, interest, or fantasy that is outside the bounds of what we would consider like normative sexuality. But the thing that's tricky about that is that normative sexuality is defined by certain groups of people that don't necessarily like speak for everyone, and also it changes a lot over time. So like the example I like to give of this is a lot of people think it's weird to call your partner daddy or mommy in bed, but then they don't think it's weird to call your partner baby in bed, even though like baby is also a term that indicates like a certain age in relation to yourself. And it's just one of those things where because it's become normalized, we don't see that as a kink necessarily, even though I think you could make the argument that it is. And so I see kink as any sexual desire that kind of goes outside of the standard like main sex acts that we all know, like intercourse, oral, fingering, like anything that's a little less basic than that. I think you could make an argument for it being a kink.
And I guess like just so we are on the same page terminology wise with listeners and viewers, if you support us on Patreon, what would you the general term for people that are outside of the lifestyle of kink would be considered vanilla, correct?
Yeah, and I think sometimes people think that that's a derogatory term. I don't really see it that way. As I say in the book, something like vanilla is a great flavor too. Like it really is. And, even I as a kinky person have vanilla sex, in between kinky stuff sometimes. And it's, there's nothing wrong with being vanilla. But yeah, I think a lot of times vanilla people may have trouble understanding where kinky people are coming from.
And I think for me, like reading this book, I would definitely say that I lean more on the adventurous side of the kink. There's a lot of things that are that I wouldn't even have kind of considered into that. I think when people largely think of kinks, you're thinking in terms of things like, maybe swingers, toys, gags, and rope, and so I guess like when you were compiling this list, what was kind of the what was the overall kind of like process for categorizing these things to kind of make sure that there was enough information to where each kink discussed in the book kind of stands on its own, but also at the same time made those that may align with those kinks feel seen and heard?
Mm. Yeah, I think in putting together the list, and that was a very tricky part as well of the process. But I really wanted to pick 101 kinks that not only the average person would physically be able to do and be able to access the equipment for if it needs equipment, but also that the average person might be able to understand why that thing would be hot. And that's a big part of the book, is explaining for each kink, like people who are into this, what do they say generally about why they're into it? Like what are the elements of it that they find hot, whether it be the taboo or the power exchange or the sensory experience or something like that. And so there were a few things that were on the original list that got cut. Like I this is so silly, but I originally had an item on the list that was autofellatio, like as in like giving yourself a blowjob, which takes quite a bit of contortion. But my thinking was, you don't necessarily need to be able to physically do that in order to like eroticize the attempt or the idea of doing it. Or you could, bend yourself into an odd shape and like come on your own face, even if you can't like put your mouth on it. But my editor was like, yeah, I think we need to cut that one because not everybody can do that. And I was like, that's fair. I made a case for it, but yeah, I think we replaced it with nudity, which everybody can do. So
One of the things too that like, just to kind of bring up other kinks that didn't quite make the cut, you brought up clown fetishes earlier. Also another one that I'm surprised at how many people I know with them, and also how it's been portrayed in media, ranging from the Poughkeepsie tapes to something like Bob's Burgers, is balloon popping, or like balloon play, whatever the technical term for it is. I mean, in researching a lot of these stuffs, a lot of the stuff that's within the book, I mean, what was the process like for you? Where is it like, having conversations and open dialogue with, perhaps sex shops or sex workers or sex therapists or something along like that, to kind of have an understanding of really what the common kinks are that most people have.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of research out there that helps establish what the common kinks are. The problem is a lot of them are relatively short lists, because the kinks that are best known are like really popular, and then there's also a lot of much smaller niche ones. But so I looked at some of those studies in terms of like prevalence of kinks. But in terms of like researching the information for the individual kinks, like I've been in the sex media industry for over a decade. So I'm lucky enough to know a lot of people in that world who are doing sex education, kink education, or who have written books about different topics within that field. And so a lot of the kinks in the book are things that I have done. And so I pulled from the resources where I originally learned how to do those things, and also did new research to see what else is out there now. And then there were some things in there that I either like haven't done or just don't feel like I know enough about. And in that case, I would just try to seek out resources from people who've done a lot of it. And I think it's one of the really beautiful things about the kink community is that there's a lot of knowledge sharing. Because we all, well, not all of us, I can't speak for all of us, but I think the community at large wants each other to succeed and to be able to enjoy these things, especially safely. And so there are a lot of people out there teaching this information, which is great.
Like I brought this up earlier, but entering into the world of kind of kink is very overwhelming because there is a lot. I mean, there's 101 things that even you can do. But what are some of the more common kinks that you find people have? I know that obviously things like feet fetish and even some of the ones that you talk about in your book with anal play and ass worship and genital worship. But what are some of the ones that you would classify kind of as like the most common that you had to kind of come across within your time in the kink community, but also in the process of writing the book?
Yeah, a lot of people think that the term kink is interchangeable with BDSM, but BDSM actually refers to a specific group of kinks, which happen to be some of the most popular ones, and the ones that are most often represented in media, like 50 Shades of Grey, that kind of thing. So BDSM, some of the letters stand for more than one thing. So what it stands for is bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, sadism, and masochism. And I think that, is that right? Did I say that right? Bondage, bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, sadism, and masculine. Okay, yeah. Had to double check that one. And yeah, those are definitely some of the most popular and like the best represented kinks. I think especially dominance and submission and sadism and masochism are really big concepts that can exist in like a lot of different kinks. Like you can do pretty much any kink in this book in a way that's like dominant or a way that's more submissive. A lot of the pain-based kinks obviously involve sadism and or masochism. So yeah, I think that the BDSM umbrella is some of the most popular kinks. And in terms of like body parts, yeah, feet are often cited as the most fetishized body part, apart from the ones that you would kind of already consider to be sexual: boobs, butt, genitals, that kind of thing.
I'm curious if you like know why that is, or if you were able to like find a thing, because I've always just been kind of like looked at feet. It's like my feet are gross, so like it's a kink that like I don't necessarily want to shame others. It's just a kink that I don't understand. Do you know why that's such a I guess like popular fetish to have?
I think there's three main reasons that seem convincing to me. There's, kind of infinite reasons. You could ask a bunch of foot fetishists what they think their reason is, and they would have different ones. But I think for one thing, the feet are very sensitive, and for some people, they're sexually sensitive. For another thing, the feet are a very powerful symbol in terms of power. Like if someone is standing on you or trampling on you or you're kissing their feet, like that has very specific connotations in terms of dominance or submission. And then on a more like neurological level, there's a theory about I think it's called neurological crosstalk. And it's a theory that has to do with where the part of the brain that controls sensation in the feet is located, which apparently is close to where the part that controls sensation in the genitals is located. So some people think that there can be sort of crosstalk between the neurons in those two areas, which could create associations in the brain between like genital pleasure and feet pleasure of some kind.
That's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
To kind of hear and understand that. Even some of the topics that your book covers, things like games or shaving or objectification or adultification, that some of these things, they're so common, and I think that sometimes we just kind of fail to see that they can be used in a more sexualized manner, and we don't bring them into the bedroom because of how common they are. But what are some of the like do you have like anything else along those lines that is something that we consider common every day that could most certainly kind of be taken into the world of kink or into the world of fetishes?
Yeah, I think that anytime you want to do some kind of service for your partner to help them out or to make their day better or just sort of to give them pleasure, whether that be sexual or otherwise, I think that that can be kinkified pretty easily in terms of having like a dominant and submissive role. Like I have certain household tasks that are sort of part of my submissive role when I'm with my partner. We're long distance, so we're not always physically together. But also stuff like when their shoes are dirty, I might do what's called a boot blacking scene, which is where you like, clean and shine the leather of the shoes, but in a way that's like worshipful. And I mean, the way that I do it is definitely like worshipful and submissive. And that's powerful. Like it's an interesting headspace to be so focused on doing a service like that for a partner and to be thinking of it as a sexy service. I think that just the intention and headspace can change a lot of things that otherwise wouldn't really seem that kinky or that sexy. And then, you mentioned shaving. That's another sort of service that you could do for somebody, like a personal care task. I think a lot of these tasks that we usually do for ourselves are very intimate for that reason. Like probably you haven't let someone else shave you like ever. If you haven't like experimented with it in a kinky way. I mean, unless you're like going to the barber, but I'm talking about like shaving your body, like it would be pretty unusual. And so I think a lot of these acts that are like personal care services, yeah, they feel they have like a charge to them potentially because it's not something that you usually share with somebody.
I want to go back to BDSM real quick. In particular, it. I talked about this like earlier that there's a lot of negative connotations, and particularly like the BDSM. I'm glad that you kind of brought it up. That BDSM and kink, a lot of people that are outside of the community or outside of like even practicing or even beginning to practice really think that there can kind of be those interchangeable things, and that's not always the case. One of the things that growing up, I grew up and I was like very much into like heavy music. I still am, but one of the things that always kind of scared my mom, particularly about that music, was Hot Topic. And Hot Topic it was like in its glory days, it was like this like gothic paradise. Now it's kind of like a Spencer's knockoff. But I think it's kind of a great example of kind of like also the what the community's like and kind of breaking down those expectations, because at the end of the day you find out that these are just people with different takes than yours when it comes to the bedroom. I love the fact that in your book you do talk about vanilla being a great flavor too. And so sometimes I think that explaining BDSM to certain people, what are great entry points into either trying that lifestyle for the first time, or even going in and doing like research, or like what's a good place to start?
Yeah, I usually recommend that people take a look at the table of contents of my book, either by themselves or with a partner, and just sort of flag anything that catches their eye. Because even if you've never done any of the things on the list, uh, you might have a sort of natural intuitive pull toward some of them, or at least a curiosity. And I think that that's a good starting point. One really easy thing that I often tell people to start with if they're interested, especially in like dominance and submission, is to sit down with their partner and choose like names for those roles for themselves, whether that's like master, mistress, daddy, mommy, little one, like whatever sort of dominant and submissive names you want to experiment with, even like sir, ma'am, that kind of thing. And just try using those in certain sexual situations or even non-sexual situations and just like see how that feels. I think a lot of the practical suggestions in my book are designed to really be baby steps, at least the first ones out of 3 on each section, because I know that for a lot of people, this stuff can be really overwhelming. And so a lot of times there's tips in there that are like, just fantasize about doing this thing, just see how that feels or whatever. Because I think that when you've practiced something in your head or in small ways, like just calling somebody a particular name, it helps ease you in. So it's not quite as shocking.
One of the things that that your book talks about is this also, obviously when you are either you've never been with a serious partner or you're in between partners, you part of that process is you have to know what you like sexually, what turns you on, what really, draws you out and makes you come and ejaculate and all these other things, like what brings you pleasure at the end of the day. One of the
Mhm.
things that I really appreciate about your book is that, trying these things by yourself. I mean, there's a chapter on here specifically about panties, and there's like a suggestion about, trying to masturbate along with panties and kind of like going over, even from a solo perspective, what does kink look like for a solo individual, and that process look like, um, from person to person?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about this because I think solo kink is a really important idea that doesn't get talked about very much. And part of why I wanted to include it, I think that there's 2 main types of people who really benefit from these solo activity tips. One of them is people who are kinky or think they might be kinky, but they don't have a partner, and maybe they've like never even had the courage to bring it up with people they've dated before. And so, yeah, they're wanting to gain a little more confidence in their self knowledge about their sexuality before they try to date other kinky people, or just sort of while they're waiting around for that right person to show up. And then the other reason I wanted to do it is that I know that there are a lot of people who are in a relationship, maybe a long-term relationship, and they're starting to have desires and thoughts, or maybe they always have had these desires and thoughts that are kinky, but they don't know how to bring them up with a partner. And so again, I think like helping them build their confidence in these solo situations might make it easier for them to bring that information to their partner eventually. Um, but I definitely did a lot of solo kink in my like early to mid 20s when I was figuring out that I was kinky, and I didn't really have any dominant partners yet who I trusted enough to do that stuff with. And it would be stuff like I might do solo sadomasochism, like wear nipple clamps while I masturbate or hit myself with a paddle on my thighs or something like that. And it's partly physical and partly psychological. Like when you have pain, you're releasing endorphins, and that can be a bit of a high, but also psychologically, I might be fantasizing about the perfect person who I'm picturing is doing these things to me. And so I think, yeah, it's a totally valid way to explore kink. I think a lot of people feel like they can't explore kink until they have a partner who's down, and that's just not the case.
You mentioned something that I really want to expand upon for the next few minutes, and that is the word trust.
Mhm.
Having someone that you really do trust. At what point in a new relationship, if they are both consenting, they are both of the kinky mindset, at what point is probably a good time to start either entertaining those actual ideas or even conversations of bringing kink into the relationship?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when a kinky person starts dating another kinky person, this stuff will come up naturally in flirtation to some extent. But also, sometimes kinksters will sit down and do what's called a yes, no, maybe list, which is where you fill out this list together and you each look at each item and say either, yes, I would like to try that. No, I would definitely not like to try that. And then there's a middle, which could be, maybe I'd do it if you were really into it, or maybe I'd do it if we talked about it more, or, maybe there's a specific other circumstance that would make it feel better for me to do it. And I think that doing something like that together can be really helpful in like figuring out where your desires overlap. Because I think another common misconception from people who are not involved in the kink world is that basically if two kinky people find each other, like that's a match made in heaven. But there's actually so much variety within what it means to be kinky that it's definitely possible to be both kinky and still completely incompatible. But if someone's like never brought up kink with their partner before and they want to, one thing that I often recommend to people is to say like, I saw like an article or I saw a book or I listened to a podcast episode that mentioned this thing. Like, what do you think about that? Have you ever done that? Have you ever thought about doing that? I always tell people to blame it on me. Like, I listened to this woman, Kate Sloan, talking on a podcast about spanking. And have you ever thought about that? Because I'm happy to be that scapegoat. Because I think that gives people a little more freedom because they feel like, oh, I'm not really the one bringing it up exactly. Like this other thing brought it up. And I think sometimes that is helpful for people.
One of the things that in making this series that I've learned is that we have this tendency to overcomplicate sex, particularly about mental health. And when you're talking about this, I love kink, so like I love having these conversations. But when you're talking specifically about this power exchange or this dominant submissive relationship and the aspects in there as well, there's a mental psychological, as you kind of talked about it, element of it. And it's very important before we kind of talk about some of the mental health of this. I also just want to talk about particularly about that dominant and submissive relationships, because there are, I think I would argue another kind of misconception is that sometimes it sticks in the bedroom, and then you have certain relationships that are not exclusive to the bedroom. Like they carry that through. Like what do those two kind of different components look like? And can you kind of expand upon what I've just talked about?
Yeah, sure. Sometimes people call it bedroom only DS. DS is the acronym for dominance and submission, which would mean, yeah, you're only doing it when you're having sex and it's not necessarily part of your relationship at other times. On the other end of that spectrum is what they call 24/7 DS, which is, yeah, 24/7. You're in that dynamic basically around the clock, which, to be clear, does not mean that the submissive like has to do everything that the dominant tells them to do. It's still important to have consent, to have safe words, regular check-ins about this kind of thing to make sure you're both still enjoying it. But then there's kind of an in-between space there, I think, which is sort of where I tend to be. Like my DS dynamic with my partner is not bedroom only. It's definitely part of our everyday relationship. They kind of like even helped dom me through the writing of the book by assigning certain like rewards that I would get if I hit certain milestones by a certain deadline. And that's great and works really well for me, but I don't necessarily need my DS dynamic to be 24/7. Like there are times when I want us to speak to each other in an egalitarian way, and there are times when we're both just like not really in the mood for that type of dynamic. And then also we're both a little bit switchy, so sometimes I'm more dominant and my spouse is more submissive, and I like having that freedom to kind of have all these different modes that our relationship can exist within.
So you brought something up there that I'm wondering if you can kind of just explain real for a second. So you use the term switchy, which is which technically boils down to the term switch, which is kind of the third subclass of that power exchange. Can you kind of expand upon what that is?
Yeah, sure. So some people who are into DS only want to be dominant, and some people only want to be submissive. And a lot of people only, or rather, a lot of people are happy to do either or both, or maybe they have certain times when they lean in one direction or the other. I see myself as a predominantly submissive person, but there's definitely a dominant streak in me that can come out if sort of the right person and the right chemistry is there for it. And I've had relationships as well in the past that brought out a more dominant side or a more submissive side, kind of depending on the other person's energy and what they were into. Um, so yeah, I think sometimes people think that you can only be one or the other, but there's a lot of switches out there.
So getting into the idea of kink and mental health, I mean, this is the relationship that I think, because of the negative connotation or the misunderstandings, that a lot of times there are a lot of things that I think can be really intimidating about this subject. In particular, like, someone, it would only be a submissive because they hate themselves or that they're depressed,
Right.
you know and that couldn't actually be farther from the truth, because one of the things that I've found, through documentaries or books like yours, is that part of the power exchange, or the power dynamic, is that you are so enthralled with your partner, or the whoever a person is, that you're literally putting your life in their hands. Can
Mhm.
you kind of talk about the relationship, particularly about what it's like being in the middle of a scene, and kind of how that affects your mental health?
Yeah, sure. I did a project in university that was about kink and mental health. I was at journalism school and I pitched this idea, and I luckily had very chill teachers who let me do it. And one of the things that I learned when I did that, which was really interesting, is like people have this misconception that kinky people are traumatized or like mentally, and that's why they're kinky. But there's some research that's found that kinky people are actually more mentally healthy than the population at large. And I kind of feel like that's because they a lot of times are more open and honest with themselves and with the people in their lives about what they want and what they're into. And I think that results in like an alleviation of shame. But also I think kinky sex like requires communication to be done well, not necessarily during the kink itself, but at the very least, like when you're pre-negotiating it. And I think that when you're a better communicator, you probably can have better relationships, and then maybe that would improve your mental health. So I find that really interesting. But for me, uh, like one accusation that I've had slung at me a lot, because one of my kinks is daddy dom little girl stuff, or DDLG, like calling my partner daddy, is that I have quote unquote daddy issues. And the thing is, I do have daddy issues. Like I have been to therapy for a few years to work on stuff that's related to, among other things, my dad. And I am not of the opinion that a kink coming from a past trauma makes it fake or invalid in any way. Like, I don't really know what people are expecting me to say when they're like, your kink just comes from your daddy issues. Like, am I supposed to just stop doing that kink then? Because, like, I think I've been through enough. I don't think I need to compromise on the sexuality that I want to have. So I think it's kind of a weird argument. Um, but also, I think that kink has helped me work through trauma in a lot of ways, because I've been able to set up situations like receiving a spanking that are similar to traumatic situations from my past, but are happening in a consensual container with someone who I really trust and know is not really going to hurt me. Someone who I know is going to be checking in to make sure that they're not crossing any lines with me. And I've found it really empowering to sort of re-experience versions of some of those situations, but consensually. And I also think that the sort of endorphins that can come with kink play, and the sort of catharsis that sometimes happens where I'll just like cry for 5 minutes after a spanking, I think both of those things can be really helpful for mental health as well. Like I always just feel much calmer and less anxious after a sadomasochistic scene.
Wes Craven once talked about the idea that horror movies as a whole allow us to experience our fears, work through our fears in a controlled environment.
Mhm.
And one of the things that your book brought up is a kink called consensual non-consent, or rape play, as it was called. And
Mhm.
one of the things that chapter addresses is that, it can allow specifically trauma resulting to sexual trauma, a sexual assault,
Mhm.
is it can allow you to kind of give you power essentially to kind of work through it. And to some degree, it also can bring stuff back up. So when you're kind of going through some of these kinks or some of these scenes in the negotiations, how important is it to know your limits beforehand, and or the power of the safe word?
Yeah, a common phrase among kinksters is kink is therapeutic, but it's not therapy.
Mhm.
And I think that's really important because, yes, I know several survivors of sexual assault who have worked through that trauma in part by doing consensual non-consent or CNC, but I would never really recommend that someone do that without also having like a kink positive therapist who they're also separately working with, because most people are not psychological professionals, and kink can do a lot, but it's not magic. It's not going to solve your trauma. And I do know of cases and have experienced cases myself where you kind of rush into something or you don't do it in quite the right way, and you end up not quite like re-traumatizing yourself, but definitely like triggering stuff that like didn't need to be triggered. And so, yeah, I think that it's something that needs to be approached really carefully and thoughtfully with a partner who you really, really trust. And ideally, it's good to explain to that partner the situation, your past, like your reasons for wanting to do this. But then safe words, yes, I think safe words are absolutely vital. I talk about them a lot in the book. Some people like to keep it simple and just have one safe word like pineapple or Donald Trump that like, takes you out of the moment immediately. And that means that the scene is over and you're going to chat about like what just happened, or not. Sometimes people don't want to talk right away. But my preferred safe word option is the stoplight safe word system, which is where green means I'm fine, keep going, this is great. Yellow means like maybe ease off or slow down or check in with me. And red means I need you to stop right now. And I like this because a lot of times there is an in-between place where you're like, should I say word? Like, I'm not sure. I'm like a little uncomfortable or a little triggered, but like, I'm not really sure. And so it's nice to have that middle ground that you can say yellow, but also when I'm being dominant or being a top, like I really like being able to ask my partner, like, what color are you? Like if I'm ever not sure, and they'll say green usually. And that gives me a lot more confidence as a dominant because sometimes, someone might be wincing or even like screaming if you're like hurting them or whatever. And that can be hard to tell, if they're fully still into it.
Yeah, it's kind of weird how the brain perceives pain in those types of moments when you're like in the thralls of like the euphoria of pleasure.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know necessarily if you know enough to kind of expand upon that or why that is. But I'd like to give you the floor if you do.
Yeah, a lot of people describe a brain state during kink that's different from their regular brain state. This might be called subspace, which is when you're in a more submissive role, or sometimes people call it dom space or top space for being in a more dominant role. And there's been some research which has found that this state is really similar to a state that you can reach through like meditation, for example, but also it's really similar to what's called flow state, which is the mindset that somebody gets into if, for example, they're an athlete and they're playing their sport, or they're a musician and they're playing music. It's this mental state of flow where you're sort of doing something that's a bit challenging to you, but that you have enough mastery over that you can still do it confidently. And um, it's a it's a brain state that feels really good for people when they're in it, and also has been shown to improve people's overall mental health if they're in flow state pretty often. I don't really know exactly why that is, but I know that that's definitely consistent with my experience. Um, And also I think that the like neurotransmitters and endorphins and whatnot that are released during that type of scene can really mess with your sensory perceptions and the way that your thoughts work. Like I always notice my thoughts get very, very slowed down when I'm subspacey, and it can take me much longer to like form a sentence. But pain can feel more like pleasure, and yeah, it's a really unique emotional experience that I haven't really found elsewhere.
I love the way that there's a quote from Hellraiser that talks about pain and pleasure indivisible in that scene, and I definitely feel like that's kind of summing up a lot of what you're talking about, but keeping on the tract of the brain, and particularly how uh, sex can affect our mental health, and even the DS relationship, or whatever type of relationship that you or your partner may have, if should you be kinky.
Mhm.
And one of the things that your book talked about is psychological bondage, which I'd never heard about beforehand,
Mhm.
and I'm so fascinated by this type of kink. Can you kind of expand upon that a little bit more for the listeners?
Yeah, sure. It's kind of a fancy term for just basically like staying still because somebody told you to. I tried to find, the right term for it, and I landed on psychological bondage. But basically, it's like if your dominant partner tells you to hold a certain position or to stay totally still or whatever, like that's a form of psychological bondage. I remember when I was young, I read an erotica story in some anthology that really stuck with me where this person was lying flat on a bed and her partner put a full glass of wine on her stomach and then went down on her, and she was supposed to not let the wine spill. And that for me immediately clicked as something that I was into. And indeed, psychological bondage is one of my many kinks, because I think that there's something fun about real bondage in that you can sort of squirm and struggle against your bonds or whatever. But psychological bondage has this different flavor where you're staying still because you're trying to be good. You're trying to do what the other person told you to do. And it requires, in a way, like more mental discipline, and also can be worked into a real wide variety of interesting situations.
With kink too, there is a plethora of toys that come with it, but particularly for those that may be interested in starting in the kink communities, getting into the kink community, particularly when it comes to sex toys, what are some great starter toys that you would recommend, whether that would be solo or with a partner?
So a great starter BDSM toy is actually just a blindfold. I recommend this to people a lot because when you take away your sense of sight, like your other senses become more sensitive. And also there's this sense of like mystery or surprise or even fear, depending on what's going on. I think you can get a lot of mileage out of that. Um, for impact play or pain, like I often recommend that people go to like a kitchen supply store and get like a decently heavy wooden cutting board with a handle, like one that's not so heavy that you can't hold it or wield it. But um, I think it's good for that because it's going to be cheaper than it would be to get like a nice wooden actual kink paddle. So you can try it out. You might need to like sand the corners or edges if there's any like sharp bits, because you definitely don't want that. But I like recommending the wooden cutting board or a thick wooden paddle because you get the flat side of the paddle, which is going to be more stingy, more of like a surface level sensation. But if you turn the paddle sideways and hit with the side, then it's more of a thuddy sensation, almost more like a punch. So you get a lot of variety there. And then I think for bondage, like I don't really usually recommend much for like a starter item because there's just so many household items that can be used for bondage, ties or even socks or whatever. Just make sure that you're leaving like 2 fingers worth of space between the tie and your skin so that you don't cut off circulation. Um, but really, like, I think one of the most fun things to do when you're getting into kink, either as a solo person or as a couple, is like go to a store that has a good selection, like a sex shop that has a good kink selection, and just sort of look and see what catches your eye. Because, yeah, sometimes being in the room with the stuff like really helps you figure out what you're feeling drawn toward.
Excellent. Well, the book is called 101 Kinky Things Even You Can Do. You guys can pick it up on Kindle and in hardback. We'll provide a link in the show notes below. But Kate, where can people find you online?
Sure. I'm at katesloan.com. I have a podcast called The Dildorks, which is about sex, dating, and masturbating. I have another book, which is called 200 Words to help you talk about sexuality and gender. And I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Threads at girly_juice.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Thank you so much for taking time out to do this and talk about the book, talk about kink, kind of answer these introductory questions so that maybe if someone's on the fence, this along with the book and really kind of helps to bring them into the fold and make this world a little less scary.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the great questions.